An empire once controlled minds as effectively as it controlled territory. The Assyrian kings mastered a psychological warfare so advanced its principles still shape our world today. We start with the thundering words of an ancient ruler carved in stone. I am powerful, I am all-powerful, I am a hero, I am gigantic, I am colossal. This was more than a boast, it was the core of a system designed to dominate perception. By the end of this exploration, you will possess a decoder for the hidden language of power, allowing you to see the invisible strings of influence in both history and modern life. How did stone carvings and royal proclamations convince thousands of people to accept absolute authority? And why does the same playbook appear in today's media and politics? What does it truly take to build a reality that an entire population believes without question? From a single city on the banks of the Tigris River, Ashur, the Assyrian war machine was forged. It began not as an empire but as a trading post, a place of merchants and goods. Yet over centuries, this city-state transformed itself into history's first true military superpower. Its armies became an unstoppable force, a complex and disciplined machine of conquest. Soldiers marched in perfect formations, their equipment standardized, their tactics brutally efficient. They pioneered the use of iron weapons on a massive scale, giving them a technological edge that shattered Bronze Age armies. But conquering a vast territory from the Persian Gulf to the Nile presented a problem far greater than any single battle. How do you govern millions of people from dozens of different cultures and languages who have just felt the sting of your sword? Military might could win the land, but it could not, on its own, hold the hearts and minds of the people. The sword creates subjects, but it also breeds resentment and the seeds of rebellion. This was the empire's fundamental weakness, the crack in its foundation. To seal that crack, the Assyrian kings needed something more permanent than fear. They needed legitimacy. They needed to make their rule feel not just enforced, but inevitable. The relentless engine of their military expansion created the perfect conditions for a different kind of weapon to be deployed, one that would work on the human psyche. The battlefield victories provided the raw material, the stunning facts, for a grand story to be written. It was a story that would recast invasion as divine order and brutal punishment as righteous justice. The war machine built the stage, and now the real performance was about to begin. The written word became the king's voice, echoing through stone. Across the polished walls of his palace, King Ashurbanipal II declared, "The god Ashur, the great lord, has called my name. He has made my weapons greater than all who sit on royal thrones." This was no simple chronicle of events. It was a declaration of divine right, a direct line from the heavens to the throne. Every military campaign, every grand construction project, even the king's personal hunting of lions, was framed not as a human achievement but as the fulfillment of a sacred mission. The inscriptions presented a world where the king's will and the god's will were one and the same. Think of these texts not as history books, but as the ancient world's most permanent press releases. They were curated for public view, strategically placed where elites and foreign dignitaries would see them. They meticulously recorded triumphs and building programs, but you will never find a mention of a lost battle or a failed campaign. Every word was chosen to craft an image of inevitable, divinely backed success. This created an aura of invincibility around the king, making resistance seem not just futile but sacrilegious. Why rebel against a man chosen by the gods themselves? This foundational layer of written propaganda set the stage for an even more powerful tool, one that could speak to the illiterate masses without using a single word. The written word found its physical form in the guardians at the gate. Towering over any human who approached, the Lamassu were the empire's silent sentinels. These were not mere statues, they were architectural experiences, carved from a single block of stone to stand over 15 feet tall. Imagine a creature with the powerful body of a bull, the majestic wings of an eagle, and the wise, bearded head of a king. This hybrid being was a deliberate fusion of earth, sky, and human intelligence, a symbol of the king's dominion over every realm. To walk through a palace gate was to pass directly beneath its gaze, a moment designed to shrink any visitor, no matter how proud, into insignificance. The message was immediate and wordless: you are entering a space of superhuman power. The design itself was a brilliant manipulation of perception. From the front, the Lamassu appeared to stand still, a calm and watchful guardian. But from the side, it was shown with 5 legs, creating the illusion that it was always in motion, always marching forward. This was a being that was both static and eternally advancing, a perfect representation of an empire that was both an immovable institution and an unstoppable force. The architecture itself forced a physical act of submission, compelling you to walk between these colossal figures and under their watchful eyes. This was the first layer of a carefully constructed reality, a non-verbal declaration that the rules of the outside world no longer applied. Beyond these silent giants, the psychological assault continued, shifting from symbolic power to explicit and terrifying narrative. Beyond the silent guardians lay a world carved in stone, a gallery of power where the walls themselves told stories. These were the narrative reliefs, a sprawling stone cinema that played on a continuous, terrifying loop. Kings like Ashurbanipal II and Sennacherib turned their palace corridors into epic tales of conquest. You would see a city under siege, Assyrian soldiers scaling ladders, and enemies begging for mercy, but the story did not stop with victory. It showed what came after. The carvings depicted scenes of absolute subjugation, acts of calculated horror like impalement, flaying, and beheading, rendered in graphic, sequential detail. This was not a secret record hidden in a vault. It was a public exhibition, a central feature of the royal experience. Imagine being an ambassador from a neighboring kingdom, walking these halls. The message was not subtle. It was a direct and brutal form of communication. Resistance is futile, and this is the grotesque price your people will pay. This was the theater of cruelty, a psychological weapon designed to paralyze the will to fight before a single soldier was ever mobilized. The kings understood that a story showing the consequences of defiance could be more powerful than the battle itself. By making this violence a spectacle, they ensured that news of Assyrian might would not just be heard, it would be felt, a chilling rumor that traveled on the whispers of terrified visitors. This was psychological warfare in its most raw form, an ancient precursor to the shock and awe tactics of the modern era, all designed to make submission seem like the only sane choice. This grand narrative of terror and power was all in service of a single, unifying idea, the belief that the Assyrian king was the king of the universe. That title, Shah Kishoti, was not just a boast, it was the central pillar of a state ideology. It positioned the monarch as the one and only ordering force in a world perpetually threatened by chaos. In this worldview, the known universe was divided into 2 distinct realms. On one side stood Assyria, the land of light, civilization, and divine order. On the other side were all foreign lands, which were depicted as places of darkness, savagery, and primordial chaos. The king's sacred duty, therefore, was not merely to conquer, but to expand the borders of civilization, pushing back the chaotic wilderness one campaign at a time. Every act of aggression was reframed as an act of cosmic restoration. This ideology provided a moral and religious justification for endless warfare. It transformed invasion from a land grab into a holy crusade, a necessary service to the gods themselves. For the Assyrian soldier marching into battle, this belief system was a powerful motivator. He was not just fighting for plunder or for his king, he was fighting for the very order of the world. For the populations living under Assyrian rule, it offered a simple, if brutal, logic: submit to the king and become part of the civilized world, or resist and be branded an enemy of cosmic order, deserving of the terrible fates depicted on the palace walls. This framework was then systematically applied to specific enemies, branding them not as political rivals, but as literal manifestations of chaos. The Elamites, the Babylonians, the tribes of the mountains, they were all categorized as uncivilized forces that needed to be subdued for the universe to function correctly. This ideological machine provided a ready-made excuse for any act of conquest, turning the empire into a self-justifying entity that fed on its own expansion. But the most intimate form of control was reserved for the home itself. The Assyrian kings perfected a policy of mass deportation, uprooting entire populations from their ancestral lands and scattering them across the empire. Imagine a community generations deep in a single valley, suddenly marched 1,000 miles away to a strange and unfamiliar territory. This was not just a logistical maneuver, it was psychological warfare on a grand scale. The act of deportation served a clear and brutal purpose: to shatter the spirit of a people. Uprooted from their land, their temples, and the graves of their ancestors, a community lost its cultural anchor. Their shared identity, the very thing that could fuel a coordinated rebellion, was systematically dismantled. In its place, they became a disoriented labor force, put to work on the king's grand construction projects, building the very empire that had conquered them. The message was absolute: your past is irrelevant, your future belongs to me. This forced migration was a chilling demonstration of the king's power to reshape the human landscape of his realm as easily as an architect moves stone. He could erase your history and dictate your destiny with a single command. This policy created a vast, internal melting pot of displaced peoples, all reliant on the crown for their new place in the world, their loyalty transferred out of necessity to the only constant power they knew, the king himself. It was a form of social engineering so effective that it ensured stability not through shared belief, but through collective disorientation and dependence. The king's battle against chaos was not confined to distant battlefields. It was also performed in the royal hunting grounds. Among the most famous images from the ancient world are the lion hunt reliefs of King Ashurbanipal. These are not simple records of a sport, they are epic dramas carved in stone. The scenes show the king standing alone in his chariot or on foot, facing a charging lion with nothing but a spear and his own courage. The lion, a symbol of untamed nature and raw danger, represented the very essence of chaos threatening the civilized order the king was sworn to protect. His victory over the beast was a powerful metaphor, a public demonstration that he alone could shield his people from the wild forces that constantly pressed at the empire's borders. This was not a spontaneous hunt, but a highly ritualized and staged event. Lions were often captured in advance and released into a controlled arena to ensure the king's triumphant performance. The entire spectacle, from the release of the animals to the final, fatal thrust of the spear, was designed for public consumption. It was a piece of political theater captured for eternity on the palace walls. The artistic depictions show every moment of the struggle, the tension, the power of the beast, and the inevitable, calm mastery of the monarch. This crafted a very specific image of the king, not as a distant ruler, but as an active, physical protector. He was the strong and benevolent guardian, the one who faced the monsters so his people did not have to. Yet this carefully constructed persona of the noble hunter requires a second look. How do we reconcile the king as protector of his people with the same king who ordered the mass deportation of entire cities or the brutal punishments shown on other palace walls? The lion hunt was the benevolent side of the same propaganda coin. It presented the king's violence as justified, noble, and directed against a clear and dangerous enemy. This duality was the genius of the system. It allowed the empire to frame its ruler as both a terrifying force to his enemies and a compassionate guardian to his subjects. He could be the hunter of beasts and the scourge of rebels, with both roles serving the same ultimate goal, the absolute consolidation of his power. The performance in the hunting grounds was meant to make the violence in the conquered cities seem equally necessary, another form of protecting order from chaos. This seamless blend of terror and protection created a psychological grip that was almost unbreakable, leaving no room for any alternative vision of reality to take root. But the grandest carvings and loudest proclamations would be meaningless if their message could be altered or challenged. For an empire built on a single story, the storytellers themselves had to be brought under control. This was the final, crucial piece of the propaganda machine, the mastery of the scribble tradition. The Assyrian state cultivated a sophisticated class of scribes and scholars, the ancient equivalent of a ministry of information. These were not just clerks, they were the architects of the official narrative, responsible for composing every royal inscription, copying every sacred text, and ultimately for educating the next generation of elites. They worked within royal libraries, the most famous being the Great Library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. This was not a public institution for the curious. It was a state archive, a fortress of knowledge containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. Within its walls, the scribes curated a very specific version of the world. They collected omens, rituals, medical texts, and literary works, but they also meticulously preserved every royal decree and every account of military victory. By controlling the means of knowledge production, from the writing of the original text to its storage and its use in education, the crown enforced a rigid ideological consistency. Think of it as a filter. Any history that did not serve the state's interests, any poem that questioned the king's divine right, any economic record that hinted at failure, was systematically excluded from the official record. Dissenting voices were simply not copied, not archived, and therefore not remembered. This created a powerful echo chamber where the only version of reality that survived was the one approved by the palace. The state did not just broadcast its message, it silenced all others, ensuring that for future generations, the only history that would exist was the history of the king's greatness. This monopoly on information crafted a single, unchallengeable truth, a reality so complete that it left no room for doubt. The king's voice did not just echo through stone, it echoed through every written word, becoming the only story anyone could ever know. The control of the written word found its ultimate expression in the roar of the crowd. Beyond the silent halls of the palace, the kings brought their narrative to the streets, transforming the entire city into a stage for their power. These were not quiet ceremonies for the elite, but massive public spectacles designed to be seen, heard, and felt by every citizen. A triumphant army would return from campaign, and the victory was made tangible in a grand procession. Imagine the dust rising from the streets, the blare of trumpets, and the sheer spectacle of it all. Chained kings and nobles, once proud rulers of foreign lands, were now paraded as living trophies. Wagons groaned under the weight of plundered gold and silver, and exotic animals from distant realms were led through the cheering masses. This was a visceral demonstration of victory, a direct and unforgettable message. This is what happens to our enemies, and this is the wealth your empire provides. The spectacle did not end with military triumph. When a new capital city or a grand palace was completed, the king would host a feast of almost unimaginable scale. King Ashurbanipal II left a detailed record of one such event, a celebration for the inauguration of his new capital at Nimrud. He claimed to have hosted a feast for 69,574 guests, providing them with vast quantities of food and drink for 10 full days. This was more than a party, it was a calculated display of the king's wealth and, just as importantly, his generosity. For the common person, this lavish sharing of the empire's bounty created a powerful personal connection to the crown. It fostered a sense of participation in the empire's success, making every citizen feel like a beneficiary of the king's rule. The message was clear: the king's power is your prosperity. These multisensory events, combining the sounds of celebration, the sight of unimaginable wealth, and the taste of a royal feast, transformed the abstract concept of imperial power into a tangible, celebratory reality. The propaganda was no longer just carved in stone. It was a shared experience that resonated in the stomach and the memory of every person who witnessed it. This was the final, masterful layer of the Assyrian system, a world where power was not just proclaimed from on high, but performed in the very heart of the community, making the glory of the king feel like the glory of the people themselves. Even the king's own face was a carefully managed tool of statecraft. In every corner of the empire, from the grand palace gates to the smallest carved seal, the monarch was presented with an unchanging, idealized appearance. He is always shown with a powerful, muscular physique, a thick, elaborately braided beard, and intensely focused eyes. This was not a portrait of a man, but the image of an office. The individual features of the specific ruler were erased, replaced by a standardized symbol of absolute power. This consistency was deliberate and profound. It meant that whether you were in the capital or a distant province, the face of authority was always the same. The message was one of stability and permanence. A single king might grow old and die, but the institution of kingship, represented by this unchanging image, was eternal. This visual branding created an archetype, a figure so instantly recognizable that it became embedded in the public consciousness. The king was not just a person who ruled, he was the living embodiment of power itself. This cult of the royal image ensured that loyalty was directed not merely to a mortal leader, but to the timeless, divine office he occupied. It was the final layer of a psychological environment where the king's presence was inescapable, a constant visual reminder that shaped reality from the grand scale of a palace procession down to the intimate level of a carved cylinder seal held in the hand. This system of influence was so total, so seamlessly woven into every aspect of life, that its core principles would echo far beyond the dust of ancient Mesopotamia. This illusion of prosperity was built on a river of gold that flowed from the conquered world. Royal inscriptions meticulously listed the staggering tributes extracted from subject nations, vast quantities of silver, gold, bronze, ivory, and exotic woods. But this was never described as loot. In the official story, these treasures were the voluntary gifts of grateful nations, a rightful acknowledgement of Assyria's cultural and military superiority. It was a narrative of willing tribute, not forced extraction. This economic story was then made visible for all to see. The construction of magnificent new capital cities like Nineveh, with its sprawling palaces, intricate irrigation canals, and lush royal gardens, was presented as the ultimate proof of the empire's benevolence. These were not just administrative centers, They were living advertisements for the peace and prosperity that the king's strong hand could guarantee. The message was carefully crafted for two different audiences. For the elites and foreign dignitaries, the immense wealth demonstrated the futility of resistance, showcasing an empire so rich it could literally move mountains to build its dreams. For the common Assyrian, the narrative was one of shared success. Yes, you paid taxes to the crown, and yes, your sons might be conscripted into the army. But look at what that system provides: magnificent cities, security from foreign raiders, and a share in the greatest civilization on earth. The towering walls of Nineveh were not just for defense, they were a physical promise of safety. The abundant water in the canals meant reliable harvests. This created a powerful bargain. The people accepted the costs of empire in exchange for the tangible benefits of stability and splendor. The system cleverly reframed the empire's massive economic drain as a wise investment in a superior way of life, making the king's power feel not like a burden, but the very source of their collective wealth. Even the king's most personal decisions were claimed as messages from the gods. Before launching a military campaign or approving a vast construction project, the Assyrian ruler did not simply act on his own ambition. He would summon his teams of diviners, specialized priests trained in the art of interpreting the divine will. These men performed elaborate rituals, examining the intricate lobes of a sacrificed sheep's liver, charting the movements of planets, or analyzing the symbols within royal dreams. The process seemed objective, a search for truth in the natural world, yet the results were curiously predictable. The omens were always, without fail, interpreted as favorable. A strange mark on an organ was not a blemish but a sign of coming victory. An eclipse was not a bad portent but a signal of the enemy's impending doom. This was not a genuine inquiry. It was a state-sanctioned performance designed to manufacture divine consent. By publicizing these favorable omens, the king transformed his own political and military calculations into a sacred mandate. His decision to invade a neighbor was no longer an act of human aggression. It was the fulfillment of a cosmic plan. This clever use of state religion created an unassailable logic for any action. How could a general question a campaign that the gods themselves had approved? How could a provincial governor hesitate to send troops for a war blessed by the diviners? It systematically removed human agency and accountability from the king's choices. The burden of decision was shifted from the throne to the heavens. In this system, to oppose the king's war was to oppose the gods, a position that was both treasonous and sacrilegious. This provided the ultimate moral shield, allowing the empire to wage endless war while claiming it was merely executing the divine will, a perfect and perpetual justification that kept the war machine forever in motion. The words themselves were weapons sharpened by repetition and amplified by extreme exaggeration. When you read an Assyrian royal inscription, you enter a world of absolute extremes. Armies of enemies are never just large, they are countless, like swarms of locusts darkening the horizon. The king's anger is never mere displeasure. It is a storm, a raging flood that consumes everything in its path. And his victories are never partial or difficult. They are always total, decisive, and complete. This was not the language of objective reporting. It was the language of psychological dominance. The constant, rhythmic repetition of these grandiose stock phrases had a hypnotic effect. It was a verbal mantra designed to overwhelm any sense of nuance or alternative perspective. By describing every event with the same extreme vocabulary, the inscriptions created a monolithic reality where the king's power was not just great. It was a fundamental law of nature, as predictable and unstoppable as the sunrise. The sheer consistency of the message made it feel inevitable. After hearing for the 1000th time that the king is all-powerful and his enemies are insignificant, the mind begins to accept it as a simple, unchangeable fact. This technique is startlingly familiar today. Modern political slogans rely on the same principle of short, powerful, and endlessly repeated phrases. Advertising campaigns hammer home messages of perfection and transformation, promising that a product will completely revolutionize your life. The goal is identical: to bypass critical thought and embed a core belief directly into the subconscious. The Assyrians understood that controlling language means controlling the very framework of thought. If you can dictate the words people use to describe reality, you ultimately dictate the reality they are able to perceive. This linguistic machinery ensured that no other story could even be conceived, let alone told, creating an echo chamber where the king's voice was the only sound that ever echoed back. This entire system of influence was not a single, blunt instrument. The Assyrian kings were masters of a more sophisticated art, tailoring their message with precision for three distinct audiences. For the world outside their borders, the propaganda was a weapon of pure psychological warfare. Ambassadors and foreign rulers walking through the palace halls were meant to see the brutal reliefs of impalement and flaying. The message for them was simple and terrifying: we are invincible, and resistance is suicide. This external narrative was designed to paralyze potential enemies with dread before a single arrow was ever fired. But inside the empire, the story changed dramatically for the Assyrian elite. For the nobles, the military commanders, and the scribes, the propaganda focused on shared destiny and the tangible rewards of loyalty. Inscriptions celebrated their bravery, listed the plunder they would receive, and wove them into the grand story of Assyrian glory. Their compliance was secured not just by fear, but by a sense of privilege and participation in a winning team. The third and most crucial narrative was for the masses, both the common Assyrian citizen and the millions of conquered peoples. For them, the king was the benevolent provider, the guardian of order against the chaos of the outside world. His power was framed not as tyranny, but as the source of their safety and prosperity. The grand feasts, the secure city walls, and the efficient canals were all presented as proof of this sacred bargain. By addressing the specific fears and aspirations of each group, the kings created a web of control that was remarkably resilient. The soldier fought for glory, the citizen accepted authority for security, and the foreign enemy was too terrified to act. This was not a monolithic lie, but a set of interlocking truths, each perfectly crafted to ensure that everyone, from the highest general to the lowest farmer, had their own reason to accept the king's reality. A king's legacy is not always written in stone. Sometimes it is carved into the very bureaucracy of the state. When Tiglath-Pileser III seized the throne, he inherited an empire that was fraying at the edges, weakened by internal revolts and inefficient rule. His rise to power was not the smooth succession of a divine heir, but a moment of crisis that demanded a new story. He could not simply repeat the old boasts of invincibility, because the recent past had proven that the empire was in fact vulnerable. So he masterfully pivoted the narrative. His propaganda became a story of restoration and radical reform. Royal inscriptions from his reign are filled with a new kind of language, emphasizing administrative competence and systematic order. He spoke of replacing corrupt local governors with directly appointed officials, creating a more professional and loyal chain of command. He reformed the army, making it a more standardized and reliable instrument of imperial will. This was not the chaotic fury of a warrior king, but the measured, purposeful work of a chief executive. He presented himself as the man who fixed the machine, the administrator who brought a new era of efficiency and stability. This narrative of renewal was brilliantly tailored to the political moment. After a period of uncertainty, he offered a compelling vision of competent leadership. He was the reformer who cleaned house, the innovator who modernized the empire's core systems. This propaganda did more than justify his rule. It made his power seem essential and forward-thinking. He was not just a conqueror, he was a necessary manager for a complex state. By framing his consolidation of power as a project of beneficial reform, he disarmed potential critics and built a new foundation of legitimacy. His reign demonstrates a profound truth about the machinery of influence, that the most effective propaganda is not always about terror. It is about presenting change as progress and control as competence, a lesson that echoes through every transition of power to this day. The city of Lachish was chosen to become a lesson. When the kingdom of Judah dared to rebel, King Sennacherib did not merely conquer this strategic Judean city, he transformed its defeat into a sprawling epic carved in stone. An entire room in his palace was dedicated to this single event, a detailed visual narrative of the siege that remains one of the most powerful examples of propaganda ever created. The reliefs do not jump straight to the victory celebration. Instead, they methodically guide the viewer through every stage of the Assyrian war machine in action. You see the advanced siege engines, complex wheeled towers protected by wet hides to deflect fire, being pushed steadily up specially built ramps. You see Assyrian archers providing covering fire from behind large shields, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos of the defenders above. The story continues as the walls are breached, showing the relentless infantry pouring into the city. But the narrative does not end with the military victory. It lingers on the consequences. The next panels show the systematic execution and humiliation of the city's leaders. Prisoners are marched out in long, orderly lines, their postures slumped in defeat, while scribes meticulously record the vast plunder being taken away. This comprehensive account was designed to be undeniable. It presented the Assyrian victory not as a lucky battle, but as the inevitable result of a superior, unstoppable system. For any ambassador or provincial ruler who viewed these walls, the message was chillingly specific. This is not a generic threat. This is exactly what will happen to your city. Lachish was made an example, its fate frozen in stone as a permanent warning to the entire region. The rebellion of one city was used to terrorize 100 others into submission, proving that a single, well-documented story could be more effective than 10,000 soldiers. But the ultimate test of a propaganda machine is not how it wields terror, but how it masters the art of the apology. When King Esarhaddon took the throne, he inherited an empire deeply wounded by his father's greatest act of sacrilege, the total destruction of Babylon. This was not just any city, it was the spiritual heart of Mesopotamia, home to the god Marduk. Sennacherib had razed its temples, smashed its statues, and even diverted canals to wash the rubble away, a deliberate attempt to erase its very memory. Political fallout was catastrophic, creating a crisis of legitimacy that threatened to tear the empire apart from within. Esarhaddon's solution was a masterpiece of narrative reversal. He did not ignore his father's act, he publicly atoned for it. His royal inscriptions perform a stunning feat of political theater, openly describing the city's destruction as a divine punishment brought on by Babylonian impiety, a necessary but tragic act. He then announces his own sacred mission, not to conquer but to rebuild. He would restore Babylon to a glory greater than ever before. This was a breathtakingly flexible use of propaganda, pivoting from raw strength to calculated humility. The message was carefully crafted. The son is rectifying the father's harshness, not out of weakness, but from a place of deeper wisdom and supreme piety. By rebuilding the temples his father destroyed, Esarhaddon presented himself as the restorer of cosmic order, the king who healed the wounds of the empire and brought the exiled god Marduk back to his rightful home. He transformed an act of political reconciliation into a powerful new story of divine favor, securing the loyalty of Babylon's restive population not with fear, but with a narrative of restoration and grace. This demonstrates that the most sophisticated propaganda does not just scream power, it can also whisper wisdom, adapting its message to mend the very fractures that terror alone could never fix. The ultimate act of control is to claim ownership of knowledge itself. In the heart of Nineveh, King Ashurbanipal assembled a collection so vast it was intended to hold the entire intellectual inheritance of Mesopotamia. His great library was not a quiet sanctuary for philosophers, but a fortress for words, a deliberate consolidation of every significant text his scribes could find. They gathered epic poems like the story of Gilgamesh, medical treatises, astronomical observations, complex legal codes, and thousands of ritual incantations. This was not a simple act of hoarding, it was a profound political statement. By bringing all this knowledge under one roof, his roof, Ashurbanipal sent a clear message: every strand of wisdom, every discovery of science, and every word of the gods now resides under the protection of the Assyrian crown. He positioned himself as the sole guardian of civilization itself. This grand project added a brilliant new layer to the king's image. Beyond the warrior and the administrator, he could now be seen as the enlightened patron, a man of immense intellect and culture. It created a powerful contrast. Here was a king who could destroy a rebellious city with one hand, and with the other, carefully preserve the finest poetry of his enemies. This fusion of brawn and brains was a masterstroke of legitimacy. It suggested that Assyrian power was not merely brutal, it was sophisticated, that their dominance was justified not just by military might, but by a superior cultural and intellectual capacity. The library argued that true enlightenment flourished only under the Assyrian peace, making the empire seem not like an oppressor, but like the necessary custodian of human achievement. In this single institution, propaganda reached its most refined form. It no longer just dictated what was true, it claimed to hold the very keys to all truth. But even the most powerful king did not rule alone. Behind the throne, the royal women shaped the empire's story in their own subtle ways. While the public narrative was dominated by masculine power and conquest, queens and mother queens carved out a vital space within the official propaganda. A powerful example is Queen Nakia, the mother of King Esarhaddon. Inscriptions dedicated to her do not celebrate military victories, they praise her wisdom and her deep piety. She is portrayed as a trusted counselor to her son and a generous patron who funded the construction and restoration of important temples. This was a carefully managed role, designed to present the royal family as a harmonious and virtuous unit. The king provided strength and order, while the queen provided wisdom and spiritual devotion. This portrayal served a crucial psychological function for the wider population. It softened the hard edges of absolute power, making the distant and terrifying monarchy feel slightly more relatable. It suggested that the royal household, at its core, upheld the same traditional family values that were cherished by ordinary people. This image of domestic stability was meant to foster a different kind of loyalty, one built not on fear, but on a sense of shared principles and emotional connection. It demonstrated that no part of royal life, not even the private dynamics of the family, was left uncurated. Every relationship was staged to reinforce the same overarching message, that the king's rule was not only powerful, but also righteous, stable, and blessed by the gods in every conceivable way. The view from the conquered lands was a world painted in shades of fear and futility. For the people living under the Assyrian yoke, the empire's narrative was not a story to be admired, but a crushing weight on their collective spirit. Everywhere they looked, the symbols of their own defeat were carved in stone or enacted in their daily lives. The grand reliefs in a provincial governor's palace did not depict some distant, abstract enemy. They showed the siege of their own city, the humiliation of their own leaders, now frozen for eternity as a public monument. The taxes they paid were not merely an economic burden, they were a ritual of submission, a regular reminder that their labor now served a foreign king. And the presence of displaced peoples, those deported from other lands and settled among them, was a constant, living warning. These newcomers were a testament to the empire's power to erase identities and shatter communities, a silent suggestion that their own culture could be next. This relentless environment cultivated a profound state of learned helplessness. Why plan a rebellion when every story, every building, and every official proclaims that resistance is not just dangerous but utterly pointless? The memory of Lachish or 100 other cities was not forgotten. It was actively kept fresh by the state's own art. The overwhelming display of power was designed to do more than intimidate. It was meant to convince the conquered that their fate was already sealed, that Assyrian dominance was a natural and unchangeable law. This psychological colonization became the empire's most durable chain. An army can put down a revolt, but a broken spirit rarely finds the will to rise again. The propaganda machine's true victory was not just in making the king seem invincible to his own people, but in making resistance seem unimaginable to those he ruled. Yet every machine, no matter how perfectly engineered, has its breaking point. The very brutality that secured the empire's power also planted the seeds of its destruction. Deep within the conquered provinces, a quiet hatred simmered, a resentment that no amount of grand spectacle could fully extinguish. The system relied on a constant flow of tribute and a relentless pace of military campaigns to feed its own engine. But empires, like any organism, can only stretch so far before they tear. The economic strain of maintaining such a vast military and building ever more magnificent capitals created a deep fragility that royal inscriptions could never admit. Palace intrigues and succession disputes, hidden from public view, weakened the state from within, proving that the image of a unified royal family was sometimes just that, an image. Then, in the year 612 BCE, the entire facade crumbled in a single catastrophic event. A coalition of the empire's most bitter enemies, the Babylonians and the Medes, finally breached the legendary walls of Nineveh. They razed the city to the ground, leaving the great libraries and palaces to be buried by dust and time. The fall was so total, so complete, that within a generation the very location of the Assyrian capitals was forgotten, becoming little more than ghost stories told by local farmers. This collapse delivers a timeless lesson. A narrative of power, no matter how compelling, cannot forever substitute for sustainable governance. Propaganda can maintain control for centuries, but it cannot ultimately manufacture the genuine loyalty of a population. It is a tool for managing perception, not a foundation for building a lasting society. When the fear subsides and the spectacle fades, what remains is the fragile relationship between a ruler and the people, a bond that cannot be carved in stone but must be rooted in something real. The psychological architecture built by the Assyrians did not vanish with the dust of Nineveh. Its blueprints were copied, adapted, and refined, surfacing in the power plays of our own era. The state-controlled media of modern nations operates on the same foundational principle as the royal scribes of Ashur, curating a single, approved narrative while systematically silencing dissent. Monumental architecture still projects an image of unshakable authority, from imposing government buildings to the glittering skyscrapers of corporate empires, each designed to inspire a sense of awe and insignificance in the individual. And just as the Assyrian kings hosted feasts for tens of thousands, modern states and corporations stage massive public spectacles, from meticulously choreographed political rallies to global sporting events sponsored by billion-dollar brands, all fostering a sense of shared identity and loyalty to the power behind the curtain. The cult of personality surrounding a political leader, built on idealized imagery and repetitive slogans, is a direct descendant of the unchanging, god-like visage of the Assyrian monarch carved into every palace wall. Even the Assyrian tactic of calculated horror, so vividly depicted in the Lachish reliefs, finds a grim parallel in the propaganda videos of terrorist organizations, which use shocking violence not just to punish, but to terrorize a global audience into submission. Perhaps the most enduring echo is the ideology of the civilizing mission. The Assyrian claimed to be pushing back chaos and bringing order to savage lands, provided the moral template for centuries of colonial expansion, where empires framed conquest as a benevolent duty. This same rhetorical framework is often employed today to justify military interventionism, dressing geopolitical strategy in the language of humanitarian obligation. When you learn to recognize these ancient patterns, the world of modern information begins to look different. The persuasive techniques used by governments and corporations become transparent, their mechanisms exposed. You start to see the Lamassu in the logo, the royal inscription in the political slogan, and the grand procession in the advertising campaign. This awareness is your decoder, allowing you to see the invisible strings of influence and become a more critical and ultimately more free consumer of the stories you are told. The boastful voice of the king did not go unchallenged by time. Our ability to decode this ancient propaganda today rests entirely on the patient work of archaeology, a science that has turned the king's own monuments into evidence against them. The great excavations of the 19th century at sites like Nineveh and Nimrud were like cracking open a time capsule. For the first time in over 2,000 years, sunlight fell upon the winged bulls and the detailed reliefs, pulling the Assyrian narrative from the dust. But archaeologists found more than just royal boasts. They found the other side of the story. By comparing the king's annals with independent accounts, like those in the Hebrew Bible or the Chronicles of Babylon, a fascinating pattern emerges. The royal inscriptions claim a total victory, while other sources describe a difficult stalemate. The king boasts of endless wealth, while archaeological evidence in the provinces shows economic strain and shrunken cities. This comparative method is our most powerful tool for deconstruction. It allows us to identify the specific exaggerations, the strategic omissions, the battles that were quietly left out of the official record. We can then look back at the reliefs with new eyes, not as objective reports, but as carefully crafted arguments. Archaeology also lets us peer behind the palace walls to reconstruct the reality the kings tried to hide. The study of ancient garbage heaps, common housing, and the skeletons of ordinary people reveals a world of labor, scarcity, and social tension that never made it into the royal inscriptions. The very stones the kings used to build their eternal legacy have become the proof of their system's fragility. This is the ultimate irony of their propaganda machine. In their quest for immortal glory, they created a perfect, frozen record of their own insecurities and lies, waiting centuries for someone to dig it up and read between the lines. The hands that carved these enduring lies belong to thousands of anonymous artisans. While the king's voice echoes through history, the physical reality of the propaganda was the product of a vast, hidden workforce. These were the master sculptors who could make stone seem like flowing fabric, the scribes whose cuneiform was both art and authority, and the laborers who quarried and transported the very materials of the message. Theirs was a paradoxical existence, possessing immense technical skill while remaining utterly invisible. To chisel the perfect curl of the king's beard or to inscribe the words declaring his divinity required more than just craftsmanship. It demanded a deep, internalized understanding of the state's symbolic language. They had to know which enemy should be shown cowering, which god should be placed at the king's shoulder, and how to frame a scene to maximize its psychological impact. This was not a matter of simple copying, it was an act of ideological translation, turning abstract commands into visceral, persuasive images. Their compliance was the silent engine of the entire system. Think of the immense pressure they worked under, tasked with creating monuments to a power that could erase them without a trace. A single mistake, a subtly subversive expression carved onto a guardian statue, could mean death. Yet within this rigid control, did any of them find a way to leave a secret mark, a tiny act of defiance hidden in the stonework? We will likely never know. Their anonymity is a final, chilling testament to the machine's efficiency, a system that consumed the identities of its own creators to ensure only one name would ever be remembered: the king's. The story of Assyria did not end with the fall of Nineveh. Its carefully crafted image outlived the empire itself, carried forward for centuries by its most famous critics. The Hebrew Bible, written by authors who had witnessed the empire's terrifying power firsthand, preserved the memory of the Assyrians not as builders or administrators, but as the rod of God's anger. They became the archetypal ruthless invaders, a symbol of divine punishment. This negative portrayal was then adopted and amplified by later Greek and Roman historians, who cast Assyria as the ultimate example of Oriental decadence and cruelty. For 2,000 years, the name Assyrian was synonymous with imperial brutality, a direct inheritance of the very reputation the kings had so fiercely cultivated. Their propaganda was so effective that even their enemies could not forget it, ensuring their legacy endured, albeit as a cautionary tale. When 19th-century archaeologists unearthed the lost palaces, the world was reintroduced to the Lamassu. These colossal guardians, emerging from the desert sands, instantly became icons of ancient mystery. They captured the European imagination, influencing art and architecture and symbolizing a newly rediscovered, imposing antiquity. The kings had sought to project an image of ultimate power, and in a final, ironic twist, they succeeded beyond their grandest ambitions. The narrative they implanted proved so potent it shaped the world's memory of them for millennia, a stark lesson in how a story, once successfully told, can never truly be erased. Confronting the Assyrian propaganda machine raises a profound ethical dilemma. Is it fair to apply our contemporary moral framework to a civilization that existed nearly 3,000 years ago? By the standards of their own time, these methods were not just effective, they were brilliantly so, creating a stable and complex empire out of a mosaic of warring cultures. For its rulers, this system was not a matter of good or evil, but of practical necessity for survival and control. Yet, even as we acknowledge this historical context, we cannot simply excuse the brutality and psychological manipulation as products of their era. Understanding their methods does something more important than passing judgment. It holds up a mirror to our own world. The same core principles that echoed through the palace halls of Nineveh are now amplified by our modern technologies. We are constantly targeted by sophisticated political messaging that frames complex issues in stark, absolute terms. We are bombarded by advertising that promises a perfected life, creating a sense of lack that only consumption can fill. Our social media feeds are curated by algorithms that reinforce our existing beliefs, creating personalized echo chambers not unlike the sealed world of the Royal Library. This ancient history challenges us directly to ask ourselves a difficult question. What are the sources we accept as absolute truth today, and who stands to benefit from that acceptance? The ultimate value of studying this ancient system is not in condemning the past, but in cultivating a vital and healthy skepticism for the present. It teaches us to recognize the architecture of influence, to question the grand narratives presented to us, and to listen for the silent spaces, the stories that are not being told. This entire system amounts to a masterclass in psychological control, a toolkit so complete it feels chillingly modern. We can now consolidate its core components into a single, formidable blueprint. The foundation was the written word, the royal inscriptions that served as the official, unchanging script of the king's divinity and invincibility. This narrative was then carved into visual terror, the graphic reliefs of siege and punishment that served as a permanent warning to any who entered the palace. At the very gate stood architectural intimidation in the form of the Lamassu, colossal hybrids of beast and man, designed to shrink the human spirit before a single word was spoken. Overarching it all was the ideological framing, the claim that the king was the sole ruler of the universe, fighting a sacred war against chaos. The state wielded psychological warfare through mass deportation, systematically uprooting identities to forge a dependent populace. It engineered public spectacle, turning military triumph and royal generosity into shared experiences that linked the king's glory to the people's prosperity. Crucially, it maintained control of information through a loyal scribble class, ensuring dissenting voices were never copied, never archived, and thus never remembered. And finally, it co-opted religion, using state diviners to manufacture divine consent for every royal decision, making opposition both treasonous and sacrilegious. This was not a collection of random tactics, but an integrated, adaptable system. Its true genius lay in its precision targeting, delivering a message of pure terror to foreign enemies, a promise of shared glory to the elite, and a vision of safety and prosperity to the common people. The ultimate goal was singular and breathtaking in its ambition, to construct an entire reality where the king's power was not just accepted, but perceived as absolute, divinely sanctioned, and eternally victorious. This comprehensive toolkit reveals an ancient, yet deeply sophisticated, understanding of the human mind, a playbook for social control whose core principles we are still learning to recognize today. The propaganda of the Assyrian kings was far more than ancient bragging. It was a sophisticated, multi-sensory system for manufacturing both consent and terror, a complete psychological environment built to feel inescapable. From the silent, imposing gaze of the Lamassu to the screaming narratives of conquest carved into the palace walls, every element was meticulously designed to shape perception and enforce submission. This was not a random collection of boasts, but an integrated machine where architecture, art, the written word, and public spectacle all worked in concert to build a single, dominant reality. By learning to decode these ancient messages, we gain more than just a window into a long-vanished empire. We are handed a critical lens, a powerful tool for viewing our own information-saturated world. The core strategies of controlling the narrative, targeting specific audiences, and using spectacle to overwhelm doubt are not relics of the past. They are the foundational principles of modern influence, amplified by technology and scale. As the historian A.T. Olmsted observed, the Assyrian was the first to demonstrate the possibilities of a well-organized state. His insight points to the chilling efficiency of a system where control over minds was as vital as control over territory. Let this entire exploration serve as a lasting reminder to consciously question the grand narratives presented to us, to actively look for the human hands behind the modern stone facades of power. The ultimate defense against any propaganda machine, ancient or new, is a curious and questioning mind. If you found this journey into the heart of ancient persuasion enlightening, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more decodings of history's greatest mysteries, where we continue to uncover the hidden stories that shape our world.